Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the kind of the middle life and the theology of Dietrich Bonhoeffer for just a little bit of time. Again, I'm not trying to produce some sort of scholarly take on all this. There's tons of scholars that write on Bonhoeffer. In fact, there's so many scholars on Bonhoeffer today. It's like revolutionary. They have not only is there a Dietrich Bonhoeffer Society, it's global, and then he got his works, all 17 volumes, produced in German back in the 90s. And then they got translated to English just in the last 5-6 years, maybe a little bit longer than that, maybe the last 10 years. But all 17 volumes are now available. And then, if you'd like, I've got all the books in my office, and I'll probably bring them in here for the last video. But they produced also a reader volume of 4 of his books. They don't have all the scholarly notes on the footnotes that kind of get those out of the way. That's why they're called a reader's edition. And those 4 books, I think you can get them for $30 or $35. And those are kind of the 4 greatest hits of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I would say that they're the well-known books, the most well-known books of his. And I recommend you to get those 4. It's Discipleship. It is Letters and Papers from Prison. It's Life Together. And the book called Ethics, okay? Those 4 books are his greatest hits, and you can buy all 4 of those from Fortress Press as a reader's edition, and they're great books. They're good paperbacks. That's a great thing about Fortress Press is their paperbacks are not flimsy. They're strong, bound, and even the paperback covers and the back cover are really nice and glossy, so they don't bend super easily in the sense that they don't break in the spine or anything, and they fold open fairly easily. They're nice, heavy paper. Fortress is a great publisher when it comes to book quality. Now, I'm not going to endorse everything Fortress Press prints. Okay, that's way beyond my pay grade, nor beyond what I want to do here. But I love the way they publish books in the sense of the quality of the books. And the ones I've gotten from them on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, basically second to none. Obviously, the Works edition, the Reader's edition, and all the individual books that they have produced on him are just incredible. I probably have, along with the Works edition, I probably have about 30 or 40 books of Dietrich Bonhoeffer myself. So again, very, very, very good publisher in the sense of quality of book. Okay. So the middle of his life, so he is a burgeoning, emerging theologian of repute. He has 2 dissertations under his belt. He gets an adjunct position at Berlin University, which is the premier liberal Christian school seminary across the world, influencing people all over the place. The great J. Gershom Machen of America, along with Charles Hodge, the Prestonian theologian. Then, of course, Machen helped begin Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia. These 2 men took time to go over to Germany to research and study the methodology of the liberal scholars during their own lifetimes. And J. Gershom Machen actually was very attracted for a time to the liberal theology that he was being taught there by von Harnack, but was not convinced of, obviously, the thinking patterns, though he loved the life that von Harnack lived. So that's always important to know, that just because someone's life is beautiful and wonderful and charitable necessarily doesn't mean, okay, that they believe in the true message of the gospel. And just because someone believes in the true message of the gospel doesn't necessarily mean that their character is going to somehow be perfect and equal with that, okay? There's a disparity there that's challenging, and there's a tension there sometimes. I wish there wasn't. I wish everyone who believed the gospel had a character that grew into that gospel. And that's what the doctrine of sanctification, what we believe is we're practicing and trying to preach, that the sanctification, the growth of the believer, starts to agree with what God has said about us. However, it's not untrue because our life looks like a disaster sometimes, that the gospel itself is not true because it's a free gift. There always will be tension between that, okay? So even J. Gershom Machen, as he was over there studying with Adolf von Harnack, he's like, man, this guy is a great person, but his theology is way sub-Christian. He was basically a Marcionist. He was basically saying Marcion was right. The Old Testament and New Testament gods are different gods. Ah, no, nope, please stop. That's not what the scriptures are teaching at all. I mean, Irenaeus, Origen, Athanasius, St. Augustine are all teaching how the Old Testament and the New Testament are one canon and they're the same God from the very beginning. And that's a right interpretation of the scriptures, and so do all the creeds and confessions teaching that. So von Harnack is wildly off. And so just saying that, he was Bonhoeffer, mind you, Bonhoeffer was employed by the seminary and the university that employed these wildly liberal theologians at the time. And the sparring was intense, okay? Bonhoeffer was basically creating his own path. And he began lectures on two specific areas that have become seminal in understanding his thought. So this is kind of more of his biography to the end, and then I'll talk more about the themes of his theology last, okay? So we'll kind of try to break it off a little bit so it's more understandable. But in the second phase of his life, because his life was only 39 years long, 1906 to 1945. He was a martyr for the faith in Flossenburg and Germany. And so he was murdered. I say it, but he was martyred and murdered. So he was not alive very long, as life expectancy typically is into your 70s and upper 70s these days. But in the middle of his life is really when things started to change. He started to write on two areas specifically. He started to write on creation in the first 3 chapters of Genesis, and then he started to write on Christ as the center of everything. And again, kind of evoking a Karl Barth kind of ethic here and also theology system here a little bit. He's not a Barthian, for those of you that know what I mean by that. He's not a follower of Karl Barth, but he does like Barth's method somewhat, okay? His dialectical approach that transformed a little bit more later in his life to what's called dialogical theology, okay? Two people talking, okay? That's what it means. Dialectic is kind of a seeming paradox, but they're really, both are true kind of idea. So he kind of likes that dialectical approach that becomes more of a dialogical approach. But basically, Bonhoeffer's life starts to take the approach to the Bible that it's not just history, that it's actually got something to say to us. And everyone's like, whatever, Bonhoeffer, the Bible's just a history textbook of people's religious experiences, and our job is just to kind of figure that out and see how that's relevant, if it is or isn't, for our own time. And the problem with all that is that it continues to put the Bible down here and put humans right here as judges of the scriptures. What Bonhoeffer started to do, this is again, even before he was a Christian, he started saying, no, we can't be up here. We need to at least be right here. And listen to what the message of the scriptures are. What is the message of the scriptures? And so in the first book called Creation and Fall, which I think is one of his best books, if I think it's actually his third best book in my view. I love that he went out on a limb and took this novel approach of reading the scriptures, okay, in a way that was so different from the time. And what he did was what we call today as a theological exegesis of the Bible, not biblical or grammatical exegesis, which is more the scientific approach that people used to do. But it's kind of a middle ground. So you have like what was conservative. Conservatives are trying to research the text of the Bible from the grammar, the backgrounds, the archaeology. All those things kind of tell us what the context means, and then from that we get our theology, and then from that we get our application, okay, for living, okay? The liberals are saying over on this side, no, that's not what this is all about. This book is man-created. It's created by men. These are unique experiences. Some are related, some are completely unrelated. So it's a bunch of random, to some degree, experiences, though there is some similarity. So basically we're saying this is primarily a human document with human personalities and human experiences that they want to call God. Who knows what that really means? And so it's called the History of Religion School, where basically the Bible is kind of a book situated in the history of human experiences of religious nature, okay? Not good. Whoa there. And Bonhoeffer's saying, okay, I don't know about this. That seems to be almost presumptive with the conservative take, okay? Now, I'm not saying I believe this. I'm just trying to give you a summary. And then up here, the liberals are saying, no, this is just a human book, and it's just telling us about human experiences of what people concern themselves with who they called God, okay? Bonhoeffer starts to take somewhere in between there and says, you know what? The Bible has something to say about God. Let's listen. And so he starts to let the text talk about what theology wants to promote instead of humans saying what it says or kind of working from the scriptures with kind of an assumption that every single word and every single sentence has some sort of supernatural connotation. So again, I'm not endorsing this view. I'm simply telling you what Bonhoeffer was doing. And he kind of comes up with a middle ground of what's called theological reading of the Bible. And so his book, Creation and Fall, is a theological reading of Genesis 1, 2, and 3. And it is mind-blowing. I mean, it is like, wow. It is so good. And I think just for me, what I took away from that book is that the gospel that I believe in has been promoted from the very beginning. It's not something that just suddenly came in, John 1, okay? It's been promoted from the very beginning, this everlasting gospel that the Psalms talk about. So Bonhoeffer wrote this seminal book called Creation and Fall. People from all over were coming to his class, and he was starting to read the Bible differently than the liberals, and he was starting to kind of come alongside of a more conservative reading of the Bible that was taking the Bible seriously to read theology from the Bible with some seriousness. Kind of cool, but definitely not a trend in Berlin at the time. And then he wrote another collection of papers that have become today known as Christ the Center. And these are probably his hardest, I don't want to say too, I think they're his hardest things to read overall because they have so much of his mature thinking in those works. And there's so much to discover in there. Maybe not as technically challenging and philosophically challenging to read as his earlier books, but it's probably the most mature in some ways of his thinking that lead him to his transition. And these works on Christ the Center start to see Christ as the center of everything. So he's not just a prophet, he's not just a priest, he's not just a figure in history or a guru of some sort of a teacher. He's really becoming the center of everything in his view, which is what we would term is a reformational view of Jesus. Okay? So in this period, he travels to America. And in America, he visits Union Seminary in New York, which has now become basically a worshiper of plants, if you have seen what they've been posting. And this seminary basically comes out of the ministry of Charles Grandison Finney, the wacko who led all sorts of weird revivals in the 19th century in the burned-over district in New York. And his theology had a consequence. Its consequence is the wildly liberal and pluralistic, relativistic seminary now known as Union Theological Seminary in New York. But at the time, it housed all sorts of weird personalities, including Harry Emerson Fosdick and some others. But it also housed Reinhold Seeberg. Sorry, not Reinhold Seeberg, but I suddenly blanked. It's Neibuhr, Reinhold Neibuhr, my bad. So Reinhold Neibuhr is this ethicist. He was really fascinatingly known for his take on Christian realism. And it was kind of a short-lived deal, though I really like it myself. But he was teaching, of course, moral theology, what we call today is ethics, okay? And he was really disagreeing a lot with Karl Barth, and the young Dietrich Bonhoeffer is there for a year taking classes with Reinhold Neibuhr and Richard Neibuhr and the Neibuhr brothers there, and strongly defending Karl Barth, Bonhoeffer was doing. And he was, again, not taking the liberal approach, but not really taking what we would call fundamentalism, okay? That the Bible is kind of this document that kind of supplants almost any experience of God. It's kind of used in a way that it's almost an antithesis of any critical study of any other subject in a way. So almost like there's no truth beyond it in some sense. It somehow doesn't agree with anything in creation, which I think is a dangerous idea. And that's kind of what fundamentalism kind of ends up being. But basically, he goes to Union Seminary in New York. He stays there for a year. Okay, this is when Adolf Hitler begins coming to power. He gets the title of Chancellor in 1933 by Hindenburg, Paul Hindenburg, the famous general from World War I. So Adolf Hitler starts to take the National Socialist Party to power in 1933. Dietrich Bonhoeffer goes over to America like 34, 35, takes a year worth of classes from Union Seminary in New York, spars with Richard and Reinhold Niebuhr, goes to a number of churches, including the church of Harry Emerson Fosdick, and basically says the preaching there was trash. Okay, I think Bonhoeffer had a problem with pride, and I think he admits that. But then he goes to a church called the Abyssinian Baptist Church, historic black church in New York, Harlem. and he hears the African-American spirituals, he hears the preaching of the black church's history, and he encounters the risen Jesus Christ. Something changes. And, Bonhoeffer loves to talk philosophically, so he says, something changed. And in Bonhoeffer's language, he said, something changed. The phraseological becomes the real. That's how he termed it. In Christian speak, what we would say is, he was lost and he got found, right? He was blind and now he sees. We would say, he got converted. That's how an evangelical would say it. Same thing, okay? He just termed it differently. He became a Christian, clearly. He had a loyalty to Jesus Christ, the risen Savior, who was preached to him at Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, New York. Became a Christian, became a convert to the Lord Jesus Christ, crucified and risen. And then he takes a trip down to Texas, almost goes to Mexico. And again, this is a fascinating character whose travels are expansive. He loved travel. He loved sightseeing. There's a picture of him on a mountain. I think it might be Mount Everest. I can't remember, but there's a picture of him you can find on the internet where he's got a big old coat and he's standing on top of a mountain. You're like, what is this guy doing? Is he mountain climbing? So he's a fascinating traveler. Played a lot of tennis over there, obviously played a lot of piano, and really was found out by Jesus Christ in a historic black church. And through his experience there, actually was a Sunday school teacher to young black students in Harlem district. And he felt he knew and met and was found out by Jesus Christ. So needless to say, when he came back to Germany, his mission was very different. And as soon as he came back to Germany, he helped be a part of the establishment of the Confessing Church in 33, 34, and 35 with Karl Barth and Wolfhart Pannenberg and some others. That was basically a reaction and a rejection of Nazi Germany. And Nazi Germany was basically doing away with a historical, biblical, accurate interpretation of the Old Testament and was using some parts of the creation story to create a master race of white people. Just absolutely disgusting interpretation of the Bible, a violent interpretation of the Scriptures, and needed to be rejected categorically. However, many of the German Christians at the time agreed with it. And so this state religion became basically Nazism. Nazism was basically an interpretation, a wildly irresponsible, violent, disgusting hermeneutic of the Scripture, and took the Bible to promote its own anti-Semitic, anti-human perspective on the world. So you can see how important it is to know how to read the Scriptures rightly, because you can get the Bible to say anything you want if you do not read it correctly, okay? And so from this movement, this Nazism of 33 and burgeoning into 35, the Confessing Church creates the Barmen Declaration of 1934, which just categorically rejects Nazism, categorically rejects it, makes them all outlaws in their own country. And Bonhoeffer was a pastor. I didn't mention this, but he had pastored in London earlier in the 30s. I think it was 1930. He had pastored in Barcelona in 1927 to some German immigrants that were there in Spain, in Barcelona. And so he was a pastor too. And so he, along with many of these theologians, started seminaries and churches that were part of the Confessing Church. And through that period of time, he started what has become kind of an oasis for many Christians moving forward in the rest of history, is the seminary at Finkenwalde. And Finkenwalde was started, I believe, in 1936. And Finkenwalde, you can still visit it today. There's a society that keeps it up. It was a society of, I think it was 40 or 50 men that came to be pastors and taught there the true interpretation of the Scriptures that is historically founded, confessed, and is in line with the creeds that we all believe in as Christians. And Bonhoeffer was one of the main instructors there. And he basically set it up like a monastery almost, in some sense. And from that period, he was a pastor. He then got himself involved with the resistance movement that everyone kind of becomes aware of in popular literature and media. And from that period of his life, he, again, felt that the best way he could live, in his view, a Christian life, was to resist the Nazis, even to the point of espionage. I am not going to support that. I'm not saying that I would have done something different or would have done what he did. I don't know what I would have done, okay? I don't want to say I know. I think observing in my own world right now, I don't think I would have done that. I don't know if the law of God would teach me to do that. I don't think it would. But I didn't live in 1939. I didn't live in 1940 and 41. So I can't pass judgment. I'm just telling you, I don't know if I can agree with how he handled the situation there, being a part of the assassination attempt of Adolf Hitler. I don't know if I can say I would, okay? Because it's almost a vigilantism, so I don't think I can support that. However, Dietrich Bonhoeffer felt that the only way to oppose evil is to do what's the most loving, is to save the lives of millions by being a part of this double agency where he is actually serving in a German intelligence office but actually working for the resistance in Germany at the same time. He and his brother-in-law, Doheny is actually his name, was married to his sister, and Doheny, I think is how you pronounce it. And those guys are basically part of this intelligence web that tried to assassinate Adolf Hitler. Obviously, the assassination attempt falters in 1943. He gets arrested in some sense of connection to counterintelligence, but they don't know his full involvement. That it goes deeper than that. And he's in prison from 1943 to 1945, and in the prison, he writes letters and papers from prison. And of course, before that, in Finkenwalde, he writes the great book Discipleship that becomes known in the 1950s and 60s as The Cost of Discipleship, because he wrote the book before he died, and then it became published in English primarily after his martyrdom. And then, of course, he wrote the book on Life Together as well, in 4 weeks, actually, while he was working at Finkenwalde. So in Finkenwalde, he wrote the two great, what we would consider evangelical works of his canon. And then, of course, in prison, he wrote many things, not just the work on letters and papers, which would base all of his correspondence with Bethke and with his fiancée and with his family, but just lots of poems and lots of just theological little papers and ideas that became famous in so many ways in our time, and were made famous starting in the 1960s and on. He wrote actually poetry, and he wrote even, I think, a little play in Tegel Prison. And so just a fascinating character. I just don't know a lot of theologians that have done, I mean, John Piper writes poetry, but like there's just very few theologians that have kind of that Renaissance appeal to them and have such an eclectic interest in so many things. And of course, his book on ethics that most people consider his magnum opus, and it is his magnum opus, was actually an unfinished book of ethics. And the chapters that he wrote on ethics between, of course, Finkenwalde and his time in prison was a collection of chapters on ethics that was unfinished. And it's incredible. It's hard to understand everything there, but it's probably his most mature writing, I think. And it has a lot to do with Christ the Center that he wrote earlier. And then he stays in prison for 2 years. Adolf Hitler and his empire is crumbling. The Russians are actually coming from Stalingrad's victory in 1943, are overrunning the Eastern Front, which is basically dying of starvation and malnutrition, and not having enough ammo to fight after that loss in Stalingrad. And then, of course, D-Day happens in June 6, 1944, and the Western Front is basically falling apart. The Battle of the Bulge happens, which is like the final gasp, and it gets a great victory for Germany just for a time, and they're fighting with basically teenagers at that time, and then it starts to collapse. And so the whole German Nazi Empire is starting to collapse, and at the very last month of the war in April 1945, of course, Hitler commands the execution of all prisoners of any even remote relationship to something of espionage or traitorous actions. And so, like a criminal without a trial, with no trial, he is transferred. Okay, he is transferred from Flossenburg, and then from Flossenburg, of course, goes, and then he is hung naked. April 6, 1945, I believe. He is treated with no fair trial, was imprisoned with no trial, and was murdered, and then became, of course, a martyr. And there's so much similarity there with our belief in who Jesus Christ is, in his own life, in his own experience. And I just can't articulate exactly all of what that means, but I'm going to tell you this. That is a person who knew Jesus Christ more intimately than most of us. And I will tell you this, his martyrdom spawned movement upon movement upon movement of renewal across the world. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer's thought, which I will engage more in the last discussion, was spurned forward and blossomed from his life. There is no theology apart from life. Okay? There's just not. Let's really reject that Platonic Greek philosophy. There is no true theology that does not take into account the livingness of theology, the livingness of life. And Bonhoeffer, kind of following in the steps of Soren Kierkegaard here, in some sense Martin Heidegger, is basically teaching that the expression of true theology has to be lived. It's not just an ethic that we're supposed to follow in a sense, but it's something experienced in walking with Jesus Christ. And you'll see that more as we talk about the book Discipleship in the last discussion. So Dietrich Bonhoeffer, born in 1906 in Berlin, died basically. There's still a gravesite. There's a memorial to him. April 1945, just a few weeks, I think, before the war ended, condemned with no trial, hung naked and died and murdered, and then was a martyr for the faith. Someone whose witness continues to witness and to renew the church across the world. This is a man to emulate. This is a man whose theology needs to be studied, and a man whose life needs to be understood because of the imitation that should be in Think the Church, the way the church should evoke and witness to Jesus Christ. This is a great saint of the Christian faith, Dietrich Bonhoeffer.